Ugh. You guys know I don't like gin or vermouth. I don't know if that has anything to do with today's video, but I thought I'd mention it at least. Have you guys been paying attention to this objectivity versus subjectivity debate at all? I think it's pretty interesting because on the one hand, people are going to like different things no matter what. It's almost impossible to try and find some universally agreed upon standard on which to judge things. But on the other hand, there are artistic guidelines that people use to create better looking art. Things like, perspective, color theory, avoiding visual tangents. If everything were truly subjective, we wouldn't have guidelines like this. These ideas would be basically completely useless because while one person may value having proper perspective, someone else might not. So what's going on here? Can a piece of art be objectively good? Or is everything completely subjective? Is it worth it or even possible to try and give feedback on levels or art in general? Or is that just entirely pointless? That's what we're gonna talk about today. And I wanna start this video off by talking about what I think personally. I want to start by giving a little bit of an overview of what I personally think. Is it objective? Is it subjective? What's going on here? Well, it's both. They're both right. And I know that probably sounds a little bit like a cop-out answer, and maybe it is, but I think my reasoning is pretty solid overall. In my opinion, a lot of the arguments that lean hard towards one side or another are kind of talking past one another. A lot of the people who talk about this subject seem to be coming at it from very different angles. They seem to disagree at an extremely fundamental level. A lot of the time when people try to defend the idea that art is completely subjective, they're coming at it from a more high concept philosophical level. They're talking in a less concrete sense and usually mean that while some pieces of art may be considered good or bad by the larger artistic community, you can't say that a piece of art is objectively good or bad, because inevitably somebody's going to disagree. And they're not wrong here. On a philosophical level, literally everything is subjective because everything in the outside world has to be processed through your own subjective perception. It's technically impossible to make any actual objective statements. But obviously the idea that everything is subjective and you can never give a concrete statement isn't particularly helpful. And most people who argue for subjectivity would likely agree that it's not particularly helpful. But there definitely seems to be a difference between a piece of art or level criticism and things we consider to be facts. Like, the obvious example is 2 + 2 = 4. 2 + 2 = 4 is something that people from every part of the world are going to agree on basically no matter what. Now, they may have different symbols or names for this mathematical expression, but at the end of the day, everyone would agree that 2 things plus another 2 things equals 4 things. You'd be hard pressed to find a level or a piece of art in general that absolutely everybody thinks is good. So clearly there must be some kind of difference between these 2 things, right? At a philosophical level, you can't really say that levels are objective in any kind of sense. There's really no way to prove what is or isn't good, but allow me to try and prove it. Let's talk about math. Okay. Before you click off of this video, I promise that there is a really good point here, and that I know I'm talking about math, but don't click off the video just yet. There's important information here that I think helps to visualize the objectiveness that I'm talking about. Okay. Hopefully you're still with me, and if you are, thank you. Anyway, let's just get started. Okay, but if any of you have ever taken a statistics class, you've probably seen a chart that looks a bit like this. These are called scatterplot charts, and they're used to represent trends and data, or kind of find trends and data. And to explain exactly how that works, I'm gonna give you a GD example. So let's say you wanted to figure out how much people like a level based off of how well it uses color theory or adheres to the principles of color theory. Well, on the x-axis, you would have to try and define how well someone adheres to color theory. For the sake of argument, let's just say you can get around the problem of having to rank how well something uses color theory. I think it's something that's probably pretty easy to solve. I don't think it's a huge problem for this argument, but let's just say you can do it. You can do it on a scale of 1 to 10 of how well something adheres to color theory. And then on the y-axis, we'll have how people rank their enjoyment of that level. Assuming you've surveyed enough people to, get any oddballs out of the group, I think you're gonna end up with a chart that looks a little bit like this. This is an interesting chart, right? If levels were completely subjective, we wouldn't see something like this. Assuming this chart is somewhat accurate, it clearly shows some kind of correlation between how much a level adheres to color theory and people's ranking of that level. When people try to give objective criticism, I think this is likely what they're doing. They're using the idea that a majority of the people tend to find specific ways of using color more pleasing. And I think you can apply this idea to a lot of other different guidelines in art, things like perspective or avoiding visual tangents or, what have you. However, one of the more interesting things is that this only really works to a certain point, and it kind of falls apart when you take it to its logical extreme. It's incredibly easy and obvious to just strictly follow every single artistic guideline that's out there. And I think that's how we end up with levels that feel, kind of soulless. These are levels that are doing everything correctly, so they tend to feel like they've lost a bit of personality. There's not really anything to get attached to in a level that just perfectly executes something with absolutely no risks. This is where most objective arguments I've seen tend to break down. Logically, it would make sense that if you followed every guideline there is to its extreme, you would make something that everybody would really, really like. But this just isn't what we see. I've seen some people try to solve this issue by adding originality as some kind of objective criteria, but it's almost always defined way too loosely, and being original, I think, is almost completely counter to the other objective criteria that a lot of people tend to lay out. To show you what I mean, let's say that someone made a level that completely adhered to the typical objective criteria, like the use of color, composition, structuring, etc. That level would likely not be considered to be very original, because like I said before, it's very easy to just strictly follow every artistic guideline out there. However, if they were to play around with the colors or maybe the composition as to make the level slightly worse, that would very likely make the level feel much more original. This is why strict adherence to these principles isn't always the best idea, but at the end of the day, the correlation still exists, and it's a useful thing to take advantage of if you're a new creator struggling. You need to learn about things like color theory and visual tangents before you can really begin to break those conventions. They're very useful weapons for any creator to have in their arsenal, and acting like they don't exist or don't matter isn't very helpful. I should say though that I don't think there are very many people who would attempt to make this argument that things like color theory and composition don't matter whatsoever, but I just wanted to at least put it out there to let you know that yes, everything is ultimately subjective, but those things still matter. But again, I think this all goes back to the fundamental misunderstanding people are having when they talk about subjectivity versus objectivity in art. I want to look at those assumptions, those underlying assumptions that people are making, and really dissect them, really talk about why certain people tend to think it's objective and why certain people tend to think it's subjective. That's right, it's time to talk about my favorite subject, moral philosophy. The idea that there are objective criteria to judge levels on relies on an even more fundamental assumption that the goal is to make something that will appeal to the most amount of people. The thing with this whole objectivity argument is that even if you could objectively prove something to be good, there's no way that you could prove that you should do that which is good. There's actually a famous philosophical argument. This idea is from David Hume, that you can't get an ought from an is. And basically what that means is that no matter how many facts about the world or the universe you have, you can't derive what you should do from those facts. In order to figure out what you should do, you have to have some sort of pre-existing goal. Okay, that's a little abstract, so let me give an actual example. We know that antibiotics help to cure diseases, and we also know that diseases tend to hurt people, and that oftentimes they can lead to death. Despite knowing these two facts, you can't logically argue that we ought to use the antibiotics to heal people. In order to come to that kind of conclusion in the world of philosophy, you need to add a third logical premise that we want to cure people, and that curing people is somehow good, and that we ought to do what is good. I first heard this argument from a religious and moral philosopher here on YouTube named Alex O'Connor, who, if you like all this moral and religious philosophy stuff, I think you should definitely check out. I'll link one of his videos down in the description below. But anyway, the same logical principle can be applied to geometry dash levels, as odd as that sounds. Oh yeah, this is where I talk about idols. Let's say that everyone agreed on the idea that idols is the best level in the game. Just because there's a consensus about what the best level in the game is, that doesn't actually make it true on a philosophical level, no matter how upset that might make me because Idols is the best level in the game. If you take anything away from this video, you should take away the fact that Idols is the best level in the game. But anyway, the counter argument to this is usually, well, since everybody agrees that Idols is the best level, then if you want to show someone a level that they will almost certainly like, then you should show them Idols. And while that statement is actually true, it has an underlying assumption in it. It assumes that we want to show somebody a level that they will like, that that's somehow something we inherently have to do. There's absolutely no way to prove that that's something we have to do or something we should do. I think that people tend to miss this when they're arguing over subjectivity versus objectivity. Typically, everyone arguing for objectivity has this underlying assumption that we ought to make levels for the enjoyment of others. This isn't something that they or anyone can prove, and I think that it makes art and GD levels by extension ultimately subjective. I think that people who argue for objectivity tend to get stuck on the idea of proving that something is objectively good. I don't really think you can even do that, but even if you could do that, that still wouldn't make level criticism objective. You would still have to somehow argue that is objectively true, that you should do what is good. And I genuinely think that there isn't an argument in the world that can be made to prove that there are objective goals in art or in life in general. Of course, I'm always open to having my mind changed, and I will definitely at least consider any argument to the contrary, but I just haven't seen any argument so far that's been that convincing. To show this, I want to do a little thought experiment with you guys. Imagine there's some kind of supernatural artistic entity that determines whether or not something looks good. This entity claims to have complete and total authority over art and art critique. They could even claim to be the creator of art as a concept. He is the sole judge of what looks good and what doesn't. If such an entity were to exist and he judged a given piece of art to be poor, would that actually make it a poor piece of art? It feels like it would, right? I mean, he's the creator of art itself. How could it not be poor? But does it really? Does it follow that we ought to listen or agree with this entity? Personally, I don't think you can make this kind of argument from an objective standpoint. I don't think it's possible to say that the existence of some outside being determines what we should or should not do. You may recognize some of these points as arguments from philosophy, and a lot of these ideas have been discussed ad nauseum in moral philosophy. I just find it really interesting that they can be applied here to fucking Geometry Dash of all places. Okay, well, what now? Okay, so it's all well and good that everything is ultimately subjective, but again, that's not very helpful. If someone were to ask for feedback in a Discord channel, it's not particularly helpful or meaningful to just say that it's impossible to give them feedback because everything is ultimately subjective. I think that if someone is asking for feedback, it's likely safe to assume that they want to try and please the most amount of people, and that giving them advice based on existing art principles and guidelines probably isn't a bad idea. This is largely because if someone's just making something for themselves, I would guess that they would be less likely or less inclined to seek out any feedback from other people. I think most people on both sides of the argument inherently or at least subconsciously understand this point, and I think the mix-up comes from people not necessarily recognizing the underlying assumptions that they're making. Now, of course, creators don't have to listen to that advice by any means. If they have a specific idea or are trying to execute something that will trump any kind of advice that people give, that's what they should do. That's the role that I think criticism is meant to serve. It's supposed to help creators convey some kind of idea or emotion. The idea or emotion the creator is trying to get people to see or understand is what's important at the end of the day. It's really all that matters. This is why I personally think people tend to see Cherry Team as being a little bit soulless. The core idea behind most of their levels is to make something that just looks good. This might come in different flavors, but at the end of the day, every level they make is more or less being made to just be visually appealing. Inherently, there's nothing wrong with this, but I think if you were to try and make the same level with the same core philosophy over and over again, people are kind of going to see through that and think maybe you're being a little bit soulless, for lack of a better term. And I want to say too that I don't think there's anything that the creators in these mega collabs can really do to change that. As I said in my previous video, I know many creators from Cherry, and they are incredibly talented and creative people. But I think that maybe these levels aren't doing their talents justice. That's also why I think Mindcap is a great host, because his levels have something they're trying to do at their very core. Each level has a different goal in mind. Limbo, for example, is trying to be one of, if not the best modern memory level. I think that the majority of Cherry Team levels lack that kind of higher ambition. Again, I really want to stress that I don't think this is any of the creators' faults. I just think it's a problem with the levels themselves, and it could very easily be fixed. But yeah, I am done talking about Cherry Team at this point. I really hope I don't have to talk about them much, if at all, in the future. Anyways, I think people arguing for objectivity tend to forget to rigorously define the underlying assumptions that they're making. And people who argue for subjectivity tend to gloss over the more pragmatic aspects of critiquing levels. Technically, I would agree with the subjectivists in saying that levels are ultimately completely subjective. However, I really do believe that saying that level criticism is either subjective or objective is super reductionist and isn't all that helpful. There is a way more nuanced discussion to be had here, but I understand that it can be really difficult to fully dive into this topic all the time. It's not something that I think is practical, especially on a platform like Twitter. I've spent nearly 2 weeks just writing and thinking about everything, even kind of relating to this topic. And a lot of the times it feels extremely messy and hard to wrap my head around, but hopefully I've put something together that feels at least a little bit coherent. At the most fundamental level, I guess everything is just subjective. If you came here for a single word answer, then there you have it. It's all subjective. But I hope you take away a lot more from this video than that. I've gone over a lot, and I just want everyone to consider the stuff that I've talked about. I'll likely get made fun of for talking about math and moral philosophy in a Geometry Dash video, but I really do think that these ideas are something worth considering. I'm probably taking it a bit more seriously than I really have to, but it's honestly something that I just enjoy discussing. I enjoy talking to other people about this a lot. I think it's really interesting to draw comparisons between art criticism and moral philosophy, even though those things aren't something I would think would have anything to do with each other. I think there are decent arguments to make on both sides, and I think that saying art or GD levels are either entirely subjective or entirely objective reduces that issue down way too much and ignores a lot of the complexities hidden within the discussion. Oh, speaking of discussions, I originally had planned to do a discussion between Kulak, Wesp, Werewin, and Sirios for this video, but I think I'm actually going to make that its own separate video. I couldn't find a great way to slide it into this video, but I still want to host that kind of discussion. At the time of writing, I haven't filmed that discussion, so I hope everything went as smoothly as it could have, but I guess we will see. If it didn't, that video didn't go up, so you didn't see it, and this is going to get cut. But hopefully it did go up. Hopefully it went pretty well. And I also wanted to say thank you guys so much for the support on the last video. It was incredibly experimental, and I had no idea how it was going to go down. But you guys seem to really like it, as indicated by not only the views that it got, but how well you guys engaged with it, the comments, the likes. It's my most liked video. I have a video with 5 times the amount of views that has like 300 less likes. That's insane. That's crazy. That's really cool. Like, I can't stress that enough. That was so cool. I was really worried that the whole video would come across as being stupid or dumb, and maybe to some people it did, but I think to most people they really liked it. So hopefully you guys like this one too. I know it's pretty similar. I plan on having more shots and stuff like that once I get a bit more time. I've been extremely busy these past couple weeks with, school and work, and still trying to maintain some kind of social life. But I just wanted to say thank you guys for that whole thing. It was extremely cool to see that video do well. So I will definitely be making more of this kind of content. I don't know when the next video is going to be. I don't know what it's going to be about yet. These were the 2 main topics I had in my mind when I was thinking about filming these styles of video. So I'll have to come up with something. Again, if you guys have any suggestions about what you want to hear me talk about, definitely let me know in the comments below. It might be another few weeks before another one of these videos comes out, but the second I have an idea, I will put pen to paper and start writing. Thank you guys so much for watching. Like, subscribe, do all the fun YouTuber stuff. If you care about seeing or hearing any more from me, you can follow me on Twitter, which should also be in the description. But I think that's going to do it for me today. So thanks again for watching, and I will see you guys next time.